I remember the day I discovered my wife's betrayal as vividly as if it happened just last night. I woke up early, unsuspecting, and brewed a pot of coffee in our cramped but cozy kitchen. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother Peter, whose success had always cast a shadow over my life. I opened it, expecting a mundane question about our family gathering. Instead, I found a series of photos that would shatter my world. In them, my wife, Elaine, clung to his arm like an adoring partner, looking at him with a devotion reserved for spouses. At first, I thought it was a cruel prank orchestrated by Peter, who was known for his twisted sense of humor. But then I noticed the timestamp on each image, confirming they had been taken just days earlier. My heart pounded so hard that I worried it might burst. Elaine was supposed to be visiting her parents in another state at the time, yet here she was, draped in designer clothes I knew I hadn't bought her, smiling unabashedly at my own flesh and blood. The shock soon boiled into rage, and I felt my vision blur with utter disbelief. I dialed Elaine's phone number with trembling fingers, but she didn't answer. My thoughts spun in rapid circles as I wondered how long this affair had been going on and why neither of them had bothered to hide it properly. That night, I confronted her after she finally returned home. She reeked of expensive perfume, the kind Peter often flaunted as his latest gift. When I demanded explanations, she offered a flimsy excuse about meeting old friends. Rage pulsed behind my eyes. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed my fury, determined to gather more proof before taking decisive action. In the weeks that followed, I became a reluctant detective in my own marriage. Every time Elaine left the house, I tracked her whereabouts as discreetly as possible, combing through bank statements, phone bills, and social media posts. The more I uncovered, the more the pieces fell into place. My brother's wealth had always dazzled her, and now it appeared she saw me as little more than a stepping stone to a grander life. Late one evening, I confronted Peter at a local bar. I remember his arrogant grin as he told me Elaine deserved a better man than me. That night, I stormed out of the bar with my head spinning and my chest tight. Peter had always been the favored son, the golden child who could do no wrong. My parents endlessly praised his ambition and charm, leaving me feeling perpetually overshadowed. His success, of course, was always flaunted. A lavish condo in the city, luxury cars, and enough disposable income to indulge every whim. Now, I felt like a fool for ever inviting him into my home, for believing the polite smiles he offered when we gathered for birthdays or holidays. This betrayal burned hotter than white-hot fire. Elaine continued her charade for months, playing the role of the dutiful wife when she was home and slipping away whenever Peter beckoned. I tried to preserve my sanity by focusing on my job at a modest marketing firm, but even there, I felt haunted by the knowledge of what was happening behind my back. Some nights, I fantasized about confronting them both with undeniable evidence, or perhaps packing up and leaving without a word. Yet a stubborn part of me refused to surrender my life so easily, as though acknowledging defeat would hand them comprehensive total victory over me. I planned my revenge with a methodical, deliberate precision I never knew I possessed. If Elaine and Peter wanted a life together, I would make sure it came with a bitter aftertaste. I collected screenshots, saved messages, and even recorded phone calls whenever I could. I discovered details about Peter's questionable business practices, risky investments, backdoor deals, and mounting debts he tried to conceal. His outward display of wealth was a fragile facade. Late at night, I pored over every snippet of information, imagining the day I would bring his empire crashing down. I wanted them both to feel utterly ruined. The opportunity for vengeance presented itself when I overheard Peter bragging about a major partnership on the horizon. He was courting a new investor with deep pockets, someone who had the power to expand his business exponentially. If the deal went through, he would become even wealthier, likely whisking Elaine off to exotic locations, leaving me with the tatters of a broken marriage. I wasn't willing to let that happen. Through a mutual acquaintance, I arranged a secret meeting with the prospective investor. By then, I had ample documentation that exposed Peter's financial instability and his shady manipulative business tactics. I showed the investor every lie concealed behind Peter's polished persona, revealing unpaid loans, a string of lawsuits quietly settled, and employees who accused him of exploitation. The investor listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking for more specifics. I provided dates, figures, and emails that demonstrated just how precarious Peter's operation was. By the end of the meeting, the investor's confidence in Peter had clearly evaporated. He thanked me for my honesty and hinted that he might still invest, just not with my brother. As I walked away, I felt the first flush of satisfaction. My plan was in swift motion. Within a week, Peter's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Rumors spread that his major investor had pulled out and other potential partners grew skittish. He scrambled to do damage control, but I'd made sure to leak just enough information to spark further scrutiny. Articles popped up online questioning the legitimacy of his business model. Employees grew uneasy, some even quitting before the ship could fully sink. Through all of it, Elaine stood by his side. Part of me fumed with jealousy, but I reminded myself that her loyalty was more about money than love. Their downfall was rapidly nearing. Then came the day Peter announced his company's bankruptcy. I heard it through a friend who worked in finance, confirming that Peter's debts had spiraled out of control. Overnight, his house of cards collapsed. He lost his penthouse, his prized car, and his fancy office downtown. Elaine's social media went quiet, no more photos of lavish dinners or glitzy soirees. I imagined her dismay, knowing she'd hitched herself to a sinking ship. Part of me wondered whether she'd return, asking for another chance. The thought both disgusted me and stirred a cruel anticipation within my heart, fueling my vengeance further. Sure enough, she showed up on my doorstep one rainy afternoon, her eyes swollen from crying. She pleaded for a chance to explain, stumbling through apologies about how she'd been seduced by wealth and promises of a luxurious life. Her hair clung to her cheeks and she trembled from the cold. I felt a surge of triumph, a sense of retribution for every sleepless night she had caused me. Yet I kept my face neutral, ushering her inside with feigned compassion. She sank to her knees, tears streaming, promising she was done with Peter forever. I simply watched, silently unblinking. She babbled about regret, claiming she had never stopped loving me. Each sentence she uttered reeked of desperation, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. I had dreamed of this moment, her admission of wrongdoing, her humiliation laid bare. Now that it was happening, a strange calm settled over me. I thought about how I'd once adored her, how I'd trusted her enough to share my every hope and fear. A flicker of that old love threatened to surface, but I forced it down. Betrayal erodes love, and my wounds were far too deep to truly ever possibly forgive. I told her to leave, stating firmly that our marriage was beyond salvage. She sobbed, clutching at my pant leg, spouting claims of devotion. Her tears no longer moved me. Where were they when she was off with Peter, sipping champagne and wearing his gifts? My heart had hardened, forging a shield from every lie she told. I pulled her up from the floor and walked her to the door, ignoring her pleas. The rain outside mirrored her despair. As she stood on the threshold, I reminded her that she had chosen him when I was still giving her everything. She left, and I felt the silence of the house wrap around me like a shroud. I had anticipated feeling victorious, but a hollow ache settled in my chest. Although I refused to regret my decision, I realized that revenge seldom arrives without cost. My life had revolved around proving her infidelity, orchestrating my brother's downfall, and feeding the anger that sustained me. Now, with both of them cast aside, I confronted a gaping void. Part of me questioned whether I could ever trust again, or if my heart would remain barricaded behind these walls forever. Still, no forgiveness remained. In the following days, Elaine texted and called relentlessly, flooding my inbox with lengthy apologies. I ignored each message, occasionally skimming just enough to confirm she had nothing new to offer but regret and self-pity. My brother, meanwhile, reached out only once, sending a brief text blaming me for his collapse. The irony was laughable. He'd destroyed himself through arrogance and deception. I watched from a distance as his life unraveled further, with creditors seizing assets and former allies refusing to help. Whatever fleeting concern I felt was smothered by the memory of his betrayal. I owed him absolutely nothing. I decided to change the locks and box up the remnants of Elaine's belongings. Each item felt like a ghost of our former life. Photographs from trips, her favorite sweater, the perfume that once made my heart flutter. I tossed them into cardboard boxes without lingering. The ring she left behind glinted under the overhead light, mocking me with its broken promises. I placed it in an envelope, intending to mail it back to her, but a flicker of spite made me pause. Instead, I slipped it into a drawer, letting it serve as a deep reminder of her betrayal. Work became my refuge, a place where I could bury myself in tasks and ignore the stinging emptiness at home. My performance soared, ironically fueled by bitterness and heartbreak. Colleagues noticed my unrelenting focus, praising my dedication. I accepted promotions and raises with a dispassionate nod. Meanwhile, I caught whispers of Elaine attempting to rebuild her life, couch surfing with friends or relatives. Peter, stripped of his assets, moved to a small apartment in a less affluent part of town. Neither of them found the dream they had chased so recklessly. I couldn't muster sympathy. My heart had no leftover mercy. I sometimes caught sight of Elaine around the neighborhood. She avoided my eyes, clearly ashamed. Part of me relished her discomfort, recalling how she'd flaunted her betrayal without remorse. I continued to compile evidence of Peter's unethical actions, sending anonymous tips to regulatory agencies. My brother's life was in a tailspin, and I felt no desire to halt his crash. This was his reckoning for stepping on me, for taking what was mine. Strangely, each success in my covert war left me feeling emptier than before. Vengeance was a hollow feast, yet I couldn't stop devouring every bitter remaining morsel. As the months passed, my anger cooled into a distant ember. I began to question how much of myself I had sacrificed for revenge. I had severed ties with Elaine, irreparably demolished Peter's business, and erected towering walls around my heart. I asked myself whether true victory meant annihilating others or finding peace in my own life. Initially, I shrugged off such thoughts, deeming them weakness. However, late at night, I felt the echoes of love and sorrow swirl around me. The man who believed in loyalty and devotion was truly gone, replaced by someone who refused all second chances. My parents eventually discovered the truth. They tried to intervene, urging me to reconcile with my brother. They reasoned that family bonds should surpass any betrayal, that forgiveness was the only way to heal. But they hadn't witnessed the photos, the nights I lay awake consumed by heartbreak, the gut-wrenching realization that my own brother had stolen my wife. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. I told them I'd never speak to Peter again, nor would I allow Elaine back into my life. Their disappointment stung, but I clung to my resolve. Some transgressions can never truly be atoned for. I focused on building a future untethered from the past. I sought therapy, not to forgive or forget, but to understand why their betrayal cut so deeply. The therapist encouraged me to explore my childhood, the long-standing rivalry with Peter, the insecurities I carried into adulthood. It was a painful process, revealing scars I had pretended didn't exist. Gradually, I learned that letting go of rage didn't mean absolving those who wronged me. It simply meant reclaiming my energy. The quest for revenge had dominated my life. I refused to let it continue shaping my destiny or devouring my soul. Time passed, and I found myself on the cusp of a fresh start. I sold the house where memories of Elaine still lurked in every corner. Moving into a new apartment felt like shedding an old skin. My therapist suggested I journal, so I wrote down every hateful thought, every bitter recollection. Then I tore up the pages and tossed them away. It felt ceremonial, a small step toward healing. Though I remained resolute that neither Peter nor Elaine deserved my forgiveness, I no longer yearned to see their suffering. The ache persisted, but its sharpness had begun to dull. One afternoon, I ran into Elaine at a local grocery store. She looked exhausted, her once radiant smile extinguished. She tried to avoid me, but fate positioned us in the same aisle. She uttered a tentative greeting, and I nodded in acknowledgement. In her eyes, I glimpsed remnants of guilt and longing, but I offered no comfort. Instead, I recalled the crucial lesson I had learned. Betrayal leaves permanent scars. After an awkward pause, she hurried away, carrying a basket of budget groceries. I stood there, unmoved, my mind drifting to a future where her presence no longer haunted me. Later that week, a mutual acquaintance informed me that Peter had fallen ill. Stress, debt, and isolation had worn him down, leaving him nearly destitute. There was a time I might have felt pity, but the memory of his sneer, the pictures of him with Elaine, kept my compassion at bay. I wondered if he ever regretted his choices, if he realized he had traded our bond for a fleeting taste of triumph. If so, he would find no solace in me. Some might call it cruel to turn away from family, but pain taught me the limits of loyalty. I continued therapy and discovered renewed passions. I started painting, losing myself in splashes of color that allowed me to process emotions beyond words. My nights were no longer haunted by visions of vengeance. Instead, I dreamed of new experiences waiting just beyond my comfort zone. Occasionally, I still felt a pang when a stray memory of Elaine crept in, or a wave of anger flared at Peter's name. But those moments were fewer, and their intensity had waned. I recognized that my journey wasn't about mending old bridges, but constructing a self too strong to be shattered again. Months later, I received a letter from Elaine, forwarded from my old address. It was handwritten, pages smudged with tears or rain. She confessed she was leaving the city, hoping to find a fresh start somewhere else. There was an apology, full of contrition, but also a request. She wanted to meet before she left, to give me proper closure. I stared at her words, my heart remarkably steady. I decided not to reply. Our story was over, our bond irrevocably broken. My closure had come the day I turned her away. Nothing more needed to be said or done. Meanwhile, Peter's health declined, though the precise details were murky. Some said it was an autoimmune condition, others guessed it was the toll of stress and unwise habits. My parents tried again to intervene, pleading with me to visit him in the hospital. They believed that if we reconciled, perhaps he might find a spark of hope. But I remembered his mocking grin, the triumphant glint in his eyes when he claimed Elaine deserved better than me. I had no compassion left for the man who betrayed my trust. I would not stand at his bedside, feigning brotherly devotion. As the year drew to a close, I looked back on my journey with a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. I had survived heartbreak and orchestrated my betrayer's downfall. Yet I had also lost parts of myself along the way: innocence, faith, and the capacity to believe unconditionally in another person. In their place, I found resilience, self-reliance, and an unwavering understanding of my own worth. I no longer needed their remorse, nor did I crave their suffering. My life was my own, unburdened by illusions. If this was what it meant to move on, I embraced it fully. In a final twist, I discovered that Peter had named me in his will. The lawyer's call came unexpectedly, informing me that my brother, in his last weeks, had bequeathed everything he had left. Anger surged at his audacity, but curiosity drove me to the reading. There was little money, only debts, and a handwritten note. "I'm sorry." For a moment, I felt the weight of what could have been had he chosen loyalty over greed. Then I left the lawyer's office without claiming a cent. I owed him no absolution. My path lay ahead, untarnished, and ultimately mine alone.